Great. Hello. So welcome everybody. Welcome to this E3G webinar. This is a webinar to present our latest report, Banking on Asia, Alignment with the Paris Agreement at 6 Development Finance Institutions in Asia. My name is Sonia Dunlop. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor here at E3G, and I will be chairing this webinar. So the agenda for today is just a quick introduction from myself, just to give a quick an overview of our report. Then we're going to be doing a series of deep dives on a couple of the different chapters in the report. There are 10 chapters in total. So our colleague James Hawkins is going to be presenting the Green-Brown Finance chapter. Our colleague Iskander Erzini Vernoit is going to be presenting the Climate Risk and Resilience chapter. And then Dileimy Orozco is going to be presenting the Green Finance chapter. And after every presentation, there will be a short opportunity for questions. If I could please ask everyone to just mute your microphones if you're not speaking, that helps reduce any background noise. And if you have a question, I recommend you type it into the chat box, the Zoom chat function, as that is usually the easiest way to do so. If that doesn't work, you can also just raise your hand within the Zoom system. And if that doesn't work, then of course you're welcome to unmute and ask the question verbally. Just to let you know, we are recording this webinar and we will be publishing it once this is over and putting it on YouTube and social media and so on. So let's get going. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction of the Banking on Asia report. Bear in mind this has been the subject of almost a year's worth of work of the team here at E3G. So it's quite a substantial analysis with quite a lot of 200 pages in total actually of in-depth analysis. But just a few words on the 6 banks that we chose to analyze here and why. So the banks that we've covered in this report, this assessment of Paris alignment, are the Asian Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the World Bank, China Development Bank, Korea Development Bank, and the Japan International Cooperation Agency. And the thinking here is just because this report was done within the context of a wider project called Shifting Financial Flows in Southeast Asia, to look at both the demand and the supply of finance for sustainable and unsustainable infrastructure in the region. And these 6 banks really represent the supply of finance for all kinds of infrastructure in the region, and therefore are key to shifting financial flows in Southeast Asia and in Asia more widely. So that was the thinking: 3 multilateral banks and 3 bilateral banks. So what is our approach to Paris alignment, and how have we defined and decided to break this down? So this flow diagram essentially shows you on the left-hand side the 6 building blocks of MDB Paris alignment, the approach that was published by the multilateral development banks in December of last year on how they see Paris alignment. And then in the middle block, you see the IDFC, the International Development Finance Club's metrics or approach, or its own way of breaking it down, which is broadly speaking aligned with the MDB 6 building blocks. And so we at E3G, we've developed 16 different indicators or measures or metrics of Paris alignment that we think are the detailed tools and measures you can use to judge Paris alignment in a development financial institution, and each one slots into one of these building blocks and breaks them down further. Now here you'll see there are actually 16 different metrics. Actually in this report we've just focused on 10 of these, the 10 most important ones as we see them, but more research would definitely be very welcome on the remaining 6. Christiana Figueres from Mission 2020, the convener of Mission 2020 and the former executive secretary of the UNFCCC, very kindly did a very thoughtful forward for our report, really setting out the big picture, putting the report into the context of the wider debate, and really kind of made 2 points. The first being that the world really is banking on Asia as far as climate change is concerned. We're banking on Asia to make which is at the absolute center of a whole series of megatrends, to make those choices that will determine in many ways the outcome of the climate change efforts worldwide. And and multilateral and development and bilateral development banks have an unbelievably important role to play in this, because they are the change agents in the transition to a climate-safe global economy. They are the ones that will help set those norms and set those standards to make sure that Asian economies and societies are fit for the future. Do have a read of that if you have a moment, because it's well worth reading and set some of the long-term vision. This table here is essentially in one table a summary of the whole report. This is our assessment of how the 6 different banks that we have considered in this report, ADB, AIIB, CDB, JICA, KDB, and World Bank, are doing on the 10 different metrics. And so we use this color-coded system where gray means no data or no information is available. Red is not aligned. Orange is some progress. Light green means they're Paris aligned. And then we have this additional category, which is transformational, which is really going beyond Paris alignment, really to really catalyze the global transition. And for each of the metrics, we have very carefully defined what we consider to be in these 4 different categories and how we have judged the banks. So as you can see, it's a very mixed picture. Every bank has areas where it should be doing more, that it has to prioritize, where it needs to make more progress. Some of the banks can be considered to be broadly Paris aligned in some of the criteria. And as you can see, one of the main findings of this research is also that China Development Bank and Korea Development Bank have very little transparency over what their policies and practices and standards are in many of these different aspects of climate action. And so we're very keen to engage with them and work with them to make sure that that there's more transparency and more reporting on what is going on internally on these issues, if anything. So the overall conclusion is that some institutions, including the multilaterals, have made some progress, but for some banks like China Development Bank and Korea Development Bank, they seem to have only just begun their process of Paris alignment, and indeed that's maybe putting it nicely. For each bank, we have created a 2-page dashboard summary of the main findings on that bank to make it easier for readers to be able to look at this bank by bank as well as metric by metric, if that makes sense. So do have a look at them. They're also available as standalone documents on our website. Some of them have also been translated into Chinese, Japanese, and Korean to distribute to stakeholders there. But broadly speaking, ADB has made some progress on, especially on the knowledge bank side of it work, on the overarching climate strategy, has made some good commitments in terms of greenhouse gas accounting, has a good system for climate risk, but needs to make a lot more progress on many of the other indicators, as you can see. The overall picture for Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is that, well, clearly it's still in many ways establishing itself, establishing its policies and so on. It's a very new bank. It's a post-Paris bank, which should in some ways make it, give it a head start. But unfortunately, if you actually look at what's actually the actual what's on paper, it's not very encouraging. And indeed, they don't have an overall climate strategy. And on every other indicator, they still have a lot more work to do in order to really be able to say that they are Paris aligned, which all these banks have committed to do. For China Development Bank, and bear in mind this is, as far as we know, basically the first analysis of Paris alignment at China Development Bank, there are a lot of areas where we just don't have any information or don't have enough information to be able to say clearly one way or another this bank is at at this or that level of Paris alignment. However, in doing this research, we have gathered a lot of we have brought together all the available information in one place. And indeed, we know that some subsidiaries of China Development Bank have started to look at standards and so on. So it has allowed us to make a series of recommendations, which you can find in the dashboard, for how China Development Bank should proceed in its process of Paris alignment. An international cooperation agency, not technically a development bank, but very similar, has a very mixed picture. Some areas where it is arguably aligned with the Paris Agreement. The overarching climate strategy is actually very good, but then other areas such as for example, the fossil fuel exclusion policies, where there is really a lot more work that needs to be done, in particular in its explicit and very proactive, I would say, support for coal-fired power, and we'll be finding out a bit more about that in the next presentation. Korea Development Bank, again, a bit of a mixed picture, but here it's very clear that on almost every indicator, Korea Development Bank can be considered to really not be Paris aligned, not be aligned with the Paris Agreement, despite having made the commitment to do so and despite having signed up to the Equator Principles and so on. And so really we've identified a lot of areas here where Korea Development Bank needs to accelerate its process of Paris alignment considerably. And finally, for the World Bank, useful because obviously the World Bank is a standard setter really in many ways for many of the different institutions in this field. You can see that on a number of different metrics, World Bank can be considered to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. Sometimes there's a bit of a difference between IDO, RBRD and IFC, but also a number of areas where more progress needs to be made, need more transparency, more focused technical assistance, and so on. So you can have a look at the dashboards if you want more information. Just to let you know that there are also a number of tear-out toolkits in the report with different ideas for policies that can be used for Paris alignment, with different definitions of the levels of Paris alignment. And we've also, especially in the conclusion sections, come up with some additional reflections on the long-term vision for the role of multilateral and bilateral development banks in the climate in the field. We really see these institutions as transformational vectors of change in the climate transition. We think they have an important role to play in thinking about and planning for the next financial crisis and how the response to that can be climate smart. We think there is a role to play for meeting national financing needs in terms of financing green infrastructure, for really transformational technical assistance, for leveraging private finance, of course, and for upholding multilateralism in this space. So that's it. Are there any questions from the audience at this stage already on the report as a whole? Or if not, what we can do is we can already go into the presentations of the chapters, and then we can deal with general questions at the end, perhaps. Does anyone have any burning questions at this stage? If you do, feel free to write them into the chat. If not, then we can go on to the first presentation of the first chapter, which is going to be from James Hawkins. James, over to you.
Great, thank you, Sonia. Hi, everyone. I'm a researcher at E3G, and I've been working on the international financial institutions for about 2 years now. Next slide, please. And so, first of all, I actually wanted to start off with a previous E3G report, which was where we commissioned YouGov to do polling in some BRI countries. And among these countries were Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia, which have also been sort of the focus in this report, as they're all parts of Southeast Asia. And so one of the questions for citizens in these countries was, how much of a priority, if at all, do you think it should be for the government to encourage foreign investment in each of the following types of energy production? And as you can see, in each of the countries, solar and wind power are seen as much higher priority than nuclear and coal power. And I think this is really important to bear in mind, because often we hear the institutions in our study are very demand-led, and so we sort of conduct this polling to show that there is demand in these countries for renewable energy. Next slide, please. And so just sort of a bit of an overall picture. This is some analysis done by Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which looked at the sort of the role of multilateral and national development banks in the financing of clean energy in emerging markets. And what you can see is that these banks play a role of providing about 30% on average financing towards clean energy of sort of total clean energy financing. And so this kind of just reiterates the importance of these institutions in sort of providing finance for clean energy. Next slide, please. And so for this report, data availability was a big issue. And as Sonia mentioned, this is particularly the case for the China Development Bank and also the Korea Development Bank. So what we did is we tried to look at a large range of data sources to try and work out where there was sort of the greatest comparability between institutions. And as you can see, the sort of the two left-hand ones, which is the OECD climate finance data, which the banks actually report to. And then finally, Oil Change International, which is sort of the fossil fuel finance data that we've used for the report. And this provided the most amount of financing data for us to use. We also looked at the National Resource Defense Council coal database and also Boston University data, which looks at the CDB. But yeah, we tried to choose data sources where the banks have self-reported if possible, which is why we prefer the OECD database. But for fossil fuel financing, we've also used the Oil Change International database. Next slide, please. And so this slide looks at the ratio of clean energy related climate financing versus fossil financing. So essentially within the OECD climate finance data, some natural gas is included and some coal is also included in that. So for this particular graph, we filtered out those fossil fuels and then compared the clean energy financing to the fossil fuel financing in the OCI database. And what we can see is that the World Bank is got the largest ratio of clean energy to fossil lending at 1.27 to 1. The ADB is just behind on 1.04, and actually the AIIB and JICA both have a ratio where they're financing more fossil fuels than clean energy. And this is really important because in a previous report, we actually found that the IADB, which is the Inter-American Development Bank, had a ratio of about 14 to 1. And so it shows that all of these institutions have a long way to go in terms of their green to brown ratio. And unfortunately, because we couldn't get the climate finance data for the Korea Development Bank and China Development Bank, we haven't been able to calculate this ratio for them. Next slide, please. And so there is some self-reported data by the China Development Bank and Korea Development Bank, but this is only at the portfolio level. So the development finance institutions such as CDB, JICA and KDB report to the International Development Finance Club. And then the MDBs in this report report to the joint report of the MDBs. And what we can actually see is that the CDB, their mitigation and adaptation financing almost totals 140 billion, which dwarfs the rest of the other institutions in this study. Unfortunately, this is only a portfolio level target, and so we can't see what projects are actually sort of counted under this financing, and so this sort of raises the issue over transparency. However, you can just sort of see that sort of the Korea Development Bank has the lowest level of self-reported mitigation and adaptation financing, even lower than the AIB, which is still a relatively new institution. Next slide, please. And so then what we've also done is look at the fossil fuel financing pre and post the Paris Agreement. So this is the annual average in US dollars, billion US dollars. And what we've actually had to do is split this graph into two, simply because the China Development Bank had such a large level of fossil fuel financing compared to the other institutions. So you can see that on the left-hand graph that the China Development Bank is almost at 100% increase in their fossil fuel financing. And then when you zoom into the lines at the bottom of the graph, which is the right-hand graph, we can see that the World Bank Group is providing the highest level of fossil fuel financing, followed by JICA and then the ADB. And those two institutions, the latter ones, have seen the biggest increase of the institutions that aren't the China Development Bank. And obviously for the AIB, which was not in operation before the Paris Agreement, then we haven't been able to calculate the percentage increase. And then the next slide, please. And so then sort of the next question we ask is what fossil fuel is actually being financed. And what we found, which is really interesting, was that JICA for these particular years had a large amount of, well, almost 100% of their fossil fuel financing was towards coal. We've now heard that they haven't got any coal in their pipeline, but there is still no policy to rule out coal that we are aware of. And then you can see some of the other banks, such as the China Development Bank and Korea Development Bank, have some coal in their portfolio. And the IDA did have some for these particular years, but coal has now been ruled out. And I think the other interesting thing to note in this graph is that natural gas now constitutes the majority of financing in a lot of the institutions. And so this is sort of a clear focus area for a lot of the institutions and something that we need to think further about. And I think that is the end of my slides. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them now, or also happy to answer them at the end.
Thank you very much, James. That's a really good summary of some of the analysis in the report. I don't know if anyone on the line has any questions. If you do, feel free to type them into the chat box. I certainly wanted to just ask about financial intermediary lending, because this is an area of a lot of focus for a lot of banks now in their Paris alignment process and for civil society. We know that the multilateral development banks are going to be working on this next year and going to produce a report which they're going to publish at COP26, so next December. But I wanted to ask you, James, so what proportion of overall lending do you think is going through financial intermediaries, and what's the transparency like for the 6 different banks that we analysed in this report on financial intermediary lending?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I guess some of the institutions do more lending through financial intermediaries. So, for example, the AIB has about 15% of their portfolio going towards financial intermediaries, where an institution like the Asian Development Bank is only about 5%. But what we are seeing is there seems to be a trend towards growing lending through financial intermediaries. And unfortunately, none of the institutions have a rigorous disclosure policy. And so what E3G would like to see is a disclosure of all sub-projects that are financed through these intermediaries on the development bank websites. And at the moment, it's sort of patchy in a lot of the institutions. And in the case of the China Development Bank and Korea Development Bank, we can't find any of this disclosure at all.
Okay, and if you look at the different categories of spending, the different sort of areas of activity, is there one area where we're really missing a lot of data and that we'd like to see even more detail in the data that's reported to OECD and in their annual reports?
Yeah, I think probably one particular area I think that'd be really good is on energy efficiency. Because at the moment, a lot of projects are sort of tagged under a particular sector within the OECD climate finance database. But trying to ascertain whether this is contributing to energy efficiency directly is quite difficult. And at E3G, we advocate for an energy efficiency first principle across investments, where possible demand side energy efficiency should be prioritized as an investment. And so I think if there's more granularity around energy efficiency investments, then we can start to sort of see the split between perhaps supply side and demand side energy efficiency. And so I'd say that's sort of one particular area we'd like to see a bit more granularity on.
Great. Okay, well, that's a clear ask and something that would appear to be relatively simple to do. Great. So thank you so much, James. Thank you for that presentation of those different parts of the report. I suggest we now move on to the next presenter, which is Iskander Erzini Vernoit, who is going to be presenting on the climate risk, resilience and adaptation chapter. Iskander, over to you to present that chapter.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and James as well. So good afternoon to everyone, or good day to you, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Iskander Erzini Vernoit, and I will be speaking to you about how the 6 development finance institutions examined in this report are performing with respect to climate risk, resilience, and adaptation. So this represents Chapter 3 in the Banking on Asia report. However, it's worth noting that although this is the chapter that focuses entirely on climate risk, resilience, and adaptation, this is not the only chapter dealing with this theme. This theme is embedded within various chapters in the report, including ones on technical assistance, on the sectoral strategies, and on the overarching climate strategy. With that said, next slide, please. So, by way of background, the IPCC has been very clear that the Asian and Asia-Pacific region face unprecedented risks as a result of a changing climate, notably around flooding, heat extremes, water, and food insecurity. In some cases, this means existential risks to human settlements. In a study by HSBC of 67 countries worldwide, South and Southeast Asian countries represented 5 of the top 10 most vulnerable countries examined. So we have a huge problem, clearly, and our position is that the MDBs and DFIs have a crucial role to play in helping to address this problem. So the adaptation finance piece is key, and according to the Global Commission on Adaptation, every $1 invested in adaptation could result in $2 to $10 in net economic benefits. So as such, adaptation actions done right can be some of the most cost-effective investments that a country can take. And in many instances, these only entail an incremental addition to the individual cost of a particular project, but can yield outsized benefits in terms of avoided costs down the line. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just a moment. Okay, so over here we have, in this slide, the sub-indicators for performance on climate risk, resilience, and adaptation. Clearly, the topic is a broad one, and it is not a straightforward task to establish an overall rating of institutional performance across this broad area, and so we break it down. Our report identifies several key pillars within the area of climate risk, resilience, and adaptation, drawing on prior research at E3G and across the discipline. So the first of these is integration of climate risk management processes at the individual project level. The second is efforts toward a more structural approach to enhancing client resilience. And the third is the scale of adaptation finance flows. And so the overall rating of institutional performance in this area, thus, is a reflection of these different indicators. So next slide, please. And here we can see how that plays out. So this is the overall rating of the different MDBs and DFIs examined in this report. So in this chapter, for reasons of accessibility, the chapter is structured to look at each of the different DFIs and MDBs in turn. But for the purposes of examining the risk and resilience and adaptation theme within this webinar, we'll look at each of the different sub-indicators in turn. So if we turn to the next slide, we can see how that plays out with the sub-indicators that together contribute to the overall ratings for the institutions. So let's examine each of them in turn. Next slide. Thank you. So the first deals with project level climate risk management. And this is further broken down to look at risk screening and risk management or risk mitigation procedures, both at project level. So this is an important area because inadequate project level climate risk management procedures can expose recipient countries to unnecessary physical climate risks and financial costs. On the other hand, done right, comprehensive project level risk screening by DFIs can help countries to avoid locking in climate vulnerable infrastructure. Also, proper climate risk mitigation procedures that promote cost-effective investments in climate proofing of projects can help countries to avoid significant economic losses over the long term. So by way of examples of best practice, you have at the World Bank, all IDA and now IBRD projects are screened for climate and disaster risk since 2017. And over at the ADB now has a specific strategy for climate risk management, which entails evaluating adaptation options and identifying the best way of climate proofing particular projects. However, a lot of the other institutions are lagging behind in this respect and don't have established procedures for climate risk management at project level. Moving forward to the next sub-indicator, next slide, please. So the next sub-indicator tries to move beyond the project level and look at how these institutions are thinking in more structural terms. So it seeks to capture DFI efforts to enhance client resilience, be it at the national or company or larger level, responding to strategic client needs and resilience priorities. So we have several examples here of good practice, of largely of these institutions engaging at national level to address national needs. And I think, so one report that I would recommend reading is the World Bank Lifelines report, which underscores the importance of the resilience agenda. And one thing it does, which I think aligns very well with our thinking at E3G, is it emphasizes that resilience is not just at project level, but that projects should be understood as contributing or detracting from the larger systems level resilience. So next slide, please. This perhaps is made a little bit more clearer in the example here. I mean, one of the examples that's often cited is an individual road might be per se resilient, but if it facilitates development in a climate vulnerable area like a floodplain, then it is not contributing to, in fact, it is detracting from systems level climate resilience. And so this is a graphic from the report of the Global Commission on Adaptation about a systems approach to strengthening asset and system resilience. And so it makes the point, or analogous points to the one that I just made, also noting that infrastructure requires enhanced resilience on a systems level, and observing how building in redundancy can also enhance resilience. And so there are dividends to essentially the same project, depending on how it relates to the larger system. So moving on to the final sub-indicator, this deals with simply the DFI's past records in terms of scaling adaptation finance. So in the graphs here, we note that a number of DFIs have attained parity between mitigation and adaptation finance flows, despite adaptation finance conventionally being harder to scale. So among these, we have the AIIB. Despite being only in operation for a few years now, the AIIB has scaled its adaptation finance to levels equivalent to those at the ADB, whose levels have remained flat during this same period. Within the three World Bank Group institutions that are shown on the bottom row, the IFC is an example of an institution that should be doing more to grow its adaptation finance in the Asian region, but also worldwide. Having said that, as a positive step, the IFC has acknowledged that it has historically been lacking in this area and has committed to growing its finance for adaptation. So with that, I think that concludes my talk on this chapter. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you very much. Yes, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them into the Zoom chat box or raise your hand in the Zoom system or unmute and you can ask a question. I actually have a question. So just going back to those examples of good practice within the different banks that we studied on improving systemic resilience and systems level resilience. So just to be clear, are those examples of technical assistance programs that aim to help clients, both country and government government clients and company clients, to improve their system level resilience? What role does technical assistance play in that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think the answer is that it is both technical assistance, but also more broadly seeking to develop a project pipeline that addresses the sort of priority resilience needs of a given country or company or city. So moving beyond the project level to actually conduct, so this is where technical assistance might fit in, assessments of strategic need, and then developing plans, including investment plans, to meet those needs. So it's a broad construct, if you will, but that's that's how we looked at it, looking at several of those different things, and it's obviously also included in the chapter on technical assistance as well, where we go into examining some of the work that these institutions are doing there.
Yeah, and then going to the project level, and it should be noted that in that last slide you showed, obviously we don't have data for China Development Bank and Korea Development Bank, so that's obviously a gap that needs to be filled. But going back to project level, did you in your research find any evidence of climate risk management systems and climate risk in general having actually changed investment decisions within these banks, or have materially changed the nature of a project, or do you think we're not quite there yet?
I think we're there in some respects, but we have a long way to go, because I think it's worth bearing in mind that unfortunately, just because a given institution has procedures in place doesn't always mean that they necessarily result in too much substantive difference at the project level. In the case of ADB, I think we have a particularly robust procedure in place there, which I think we have reason to believe is leading to consistent climate proofing of projects. I think in the case of JICA, there might be a bit more work to be done in terms of ensuring that the climate risk screening and risk management at the project level actually manifests itself in actual changes to project level approaches.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you, Iskander, for that excellent presentation of the findings of our research in terms of climate risk and resilience. I propose we now move on to the third and final presentation of this webinar, which will be from Dileimy Orozco on the green finance chapter, which is a chapter looking at greening the financial system and what the banks are doing there. Dileimy, can you hear me? And are you ready to take over your slides?
Yes, sure.
Great, yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Okay, over to you, Dileimy, on green finance.
Cool. Can you show the next slide? I don't think I can control the, thank you. So I'm going to be talking to you today about promoting green finance, which is one of the chapters in our report. And one of the things we based this chapter on was on the Article 2.1c, which says that making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So this means that the financial system will require a massive change. This will include changes at the public budget level, financial regulations, but also increase best practices of market participants such as private banks, insurers, and investors. What this means is that in order to achieve this shifting of the financial flows and make it consistent with the Paris Agreement, this means that we need to be working on greening the financial system, but also financing green projects. And this is how we assess the MDBs and trying to identify how they are working towards these two goals, meaning how they're catalyzing the market for green financial products, notably green bonds, where we know some of them have been pioneers, such as the World Bank, but also how they are supporting development of green financial markets, whilst promoting improved practices within markets. The next one, please. So before I start with the summary of our findings, one of the things we need to consider is that in order to ensure financial flows are consistent with low carbon resilient pathway, we need to work on to embed sustainability in financial decision making, and this is important for the MDBs, as they have a role in increasing and fostering transparency, as well as building robust and consistent financial frameworks. And one of the things they could do to support countries is by developing roadmaps and so on. So when we look at our findings, we find that most of the development financial institutions are focusing mostly on financing green projects, less so on greening the financial system or mainstreaming green finance. So although this is laudable and is necessary, it's insufficient to shift the dial, and there is a need for a focus at the upstream public policy level, meaning regulatory system. And this is important because when we look at how how infrastructure is funded in Asia, most of the infrastructure is funded through public finance. This means that just mobilizing private capital could, well, it will help, but it won't make much difference if budgets and financial regulations are not improved and considering climate risk within their decision-making process. So in the case, if we look at in a bit more detail on what these development financial institutions are doing, they're focusing on promoting green bonds and using their market power to lead on this area. In the case of the World Bank, they're going a step further, and they're not only promoting green finance, but also supporting local and national institutions as well as insurance regulator. Then we have seen this through the coalition of Minister of Finance, but as well as, like for example, in the case of the IFC, supporting some countries to develop their own green bond framework. So this is important in terms of, as I said, in terms of regulations. So next one, please. So in general, I think what we found is that all the banks should follow the recommendation of TCFD on climate risk disclosure. This is not only on supporting the clients, but this is something they need to do within their own portfolio. Also engage with their financial intermediaries, as we heard from James. This is something they need to work a bit more in terms of transparency, but also ensure finance not directed to fossil fuel projects, as well as supporting policymakers in greening financial system. One of the things they could be doing is developing national climate finance strategy or a green finance strategy. This is very important because this is also part of the climate, the action plan of the coalition of Ministry of Finance. So potentially there is some support this Ministry of Finance are going to need in this space, as well as supporting the financial regulators, central bankers in creating this space for dialogue. There is still a lot of initiatives, which is really good, but all of them are fragmented, and there are not much discussions between Minister of Finance and central bankers and how to coordinate in terms of public risk management. Besides, there is we think that it would be one way to facilitate private sector investment in green projects is through the use of instruments such as guarantees. So far, we have found that most of the most commonly used instruments is loans, which is a very safe and low risk instrument. But I think one way for the MDBs to reduce the risk, de-risk certain projects is through the use of guarantees. So, thank you. If you have any question, please just feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Dileimy. That was a very good presentation of the different aspects of green finance covered in the report. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box. I wanted to just ask, obviously, I mentioned at the beginning, we have these 4 different levels of Paris alignment, as it were, going all the way from not aligned, some progress, Paris aligned, and transformational. I wanted to ask you, Dileimy, on this particular metric, on this indicator, what do you think these banks really need to do in order to really be able to show that they're being transformational in their impact in terms of greening the financial system and financing green projects?
Well, I think one of the things we haven't seen is the MDBs driving a systemic change across all the actors in the financial sector. What I mean about this is that isn't sufficient to focus project by project. There is a need to have a long-term strategy. This is the only way how the public sector could reduce uncertainty for the private sector. And for this to happen, the MDBs need to use their knowledge to support the countries on this. There's a lack of understanding or lack of awareness, which is in part due to lack of capacity in certain ministers on how to approach long-term strategies and how to create investment plans. And this is where at least E3G thinks there is a space for the MDBs to add value.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think as institutions that have quite a long-term time horizon, I think MDBs and bilateral development banks are quite well placed to do that. I wanted to also ask, just you mentioned your last point on your last slide there, I think, was about how we really need these banks to start using new instruments like guarantees and so on in order to really mobilize large amounts of private capital instead of the loans model, if I can call it that, which is relatively safe but doesn't really leverage very much money. What do you think are the barriers to that happening in the different banks and in general, and how do you think we can help, or the shareholders can help address that?
I think one of the barriers is the perception that MDBs are going to be taking too much risk, as this could affect the credit rating, which it has been studied that this wouldn't be the case. The credit rating agencies have already made some changes in the way they assess the MDBs, and they now include the callable capital, which means now the MDB should have more freedom to take risks. So I would say this is a better way of for the shareholders should encourage MDBs to use this type of instruments, because it means that it only will be triggered if there is a failure. But if we think about demonstrative projects as a way of leading, of creating the pathway for other, for the private sector to also participate, I wouldn't call this demonstrative projects as a failure, but just as an innovative way of attracting private investors.
Yeah. Interesting. So yeah, so it's really about increasing that risk appetite and changing the incentives there. Okay, thank you so much, Dileimy. Thank you for that presentation. If anyone has any questions, this is the moment to pipe up to ask your questions. I do encourage you also to go and check out the full report on our website and all the other different sections and associated parts of it. There's a lot of information there. Really use it as a resource in your work, and of course we're very keen to have any input and feedback over the next weeks and months as you digest it further. I see we've had a question come in from the audience just specifically on China Development Bank and their engagement within the International Development Finance Club, the IDFC Club. Is their engagement in IDFC perhaps increasing their focus on Paris alignment, or at least providing additional levels of climate finance? Dileimy, it'd be interesting actually to get your perspective on this as well. Do you think CDB's engagement in IDFC is helping to move things forward in this area?
I think so. I think there is a chance. CDB seems to be, if you read the latest sustainability report, it seems to have a increased focus on green finance, and how this is going to become Paris aligned, I'm not sure, but it seems like they're very keen on understanding what other bilateral development banks are doing, and also they're engaging on the work of, for example, the Green Investment Principle on the BRI. So I think they are keen to be part of it. In terms of saying how far they would go to be Paris aligned, I'm not sure. There is a lack of transparency is a huge issue in CDB.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And indeed, if you go back to one of those slides that James presented earlier on in the webinar, you saw that the amount of climate finance that China Development Bank is doing is very sizable, especially compared to all the other banks that we compared it to in this report. And indeed, we understand that the definition of climate finance they're using there is actually relatively conservative. So they're doing a lot of really great work. It's just about making sure that Paris alignment is fully institutionalized across the whole institution, and that they make progress on some of those other indicators or measures of climate ambition and Paris Agreement alignment. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of our webinar. Thank you so much all for tuning in. It's been great to have you. Thank you for taking the time to find out more. I hope this work and this research is useful to you in your work. As I said, any input, any comments, any feedback would be very much appreciated. Let us know if you think there's anything else we should be focusing on next year. And we look forward to being in touch with you and to working with you in future. So thank you, everybody. Feel free to also get in touch with the team if you have any further follow-up questions. Our email addresses are on the E3G website. I just wanted to also end by just mentioning that this report was part of a wider project called Shifting Financial Flows in Southeast Asia. This was a project looking specifically at the financial flows away from fossil fuels into low carbon energy in 3 specific countries, actually Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia. As I said, this report was really designed to look at the source or the supply of financing into that region. And this project was funded by the German Environment Ministry, and specifically their International Climate Initiative program. It was also in part also supported by the KR Foundation. So thank you very much to our supporters. You can see our contact details there on this screen. Thank you to you for your attention and for tuning in. We've recorded this webinar, so we will be putting it up on social media for you to share tomorrow probably. And looking forward to seeing you at a future E3G webinar. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.